SSAS dimensions, measures, and cubes. Let's assume that you have a lot of data spread over multiple databases, and maybe these tables aren't even all in SQL Server. For example, you might have some tables that are in an Oracle database, or MySQL, or any other flavor. Let's also assume that you have a huge number of tables. And let's also assume that you were given the task of extracting meaningful information from these tables. For example, if you want to find sales by country and region, maybe the year and quarter as well, well, if you wanted to extract that information using just your own SQL statement, sure, you could do that. However, it would be really complex and very time-consuming. So in this nugget, we're going to be talking about SSAS, or SQL Server Analytic Services. We'll talk about concepts such as dimensions, measures, and cubes, which allow us to easily look at our information, extract what we need to in a very simple format. So the first thing we'll discuss are the benefits of SSAS, and we'll talk about UDM, or the Unified Dimension Model. We'll also look at the SSAS Architecture and also discuss what services you need to have up and running for this to work. Then we'll get into the different SSAS concepts. You need to understand what a dimension is, what a measure is, and how that ties into a cube. And we'll do things such as formatting the numbers so it's easy to read. Well, let's first of all talk about the benefits of SSAS. If you are trying to query data directly using just your own SQL statements, you are going to encounter most likely some challenges. For example, you might have multiple data sources. Maybe you're trying to extract information from 20 different tables. You can have heterogeneous sources. As I mentioned, you might have some of your tables in SQL Server, some in Oracle, some in Postgres, or DB2. Maybe the business logic isn't clear. For example, the way the tables are joined together, there might not be obvious ways that they're joined together, so you might need some kind of visual representation. Maybe you've been given the task of partitioning out the data or performing aggregations. Once again, this is possible with basic SQL statements, but it is pretty complex. And the other challenge we have with simple data access is poor performance. The order in which you join tables together has a huge impact on how your performance runs. Well, with SSAS, it automatically tries to use the best path to extract your data. Let's talk about the Unified Dimensional Model. When we're talking about SSAS and the Unified Dimension Model, one of the important concepts here is that only the relevant items that you're interested in are exposed, and you can alias those columns if you want to. For example, you might have a table that has 50 different columns in there. Well, if you're only interested in 3 or 4 of those columns, then you can filter out the rest and not make your view look really complex. You can group business entities' attributes into what we call a dimension. Think of a dimension as a way we can organize our data. For example, we can organize our sales by a region dimension or by a time dimension. You can have as many dimensions as you'd like. And then you're going to have some kind of quantifiable data called a measure. For example, sales or total tax. Okay, so the combination of the dimension with the measures is what we call a cube. So we'll get into that in just a moment. Another benefit of the UDM is that it supports write-back. So when we're using SSAS, not only can we query data, but we can also write back to the database. SSAS has built-in security. You can use users and roles if you'd like. And it also supports hierarchical information. For example, if you want to show sales by employees and then also sales by the employees' supervisors, you can do that as well. You can also group attributes together inside of folders to make things a little bit more manageable. We have things such as semantic categories. So if you have a field such as an email field, you can specify that it's an email field and maybe it launches an email dialog. The UDM supports time, all sorts of time. For example, fiscal quarter, fiscal year, calendar quarter, calendar year, month name, and so on. It also supports translation. So if you want to display your information in English and then also display it in Spanish, that's also a possibility. We have this thing called a perspective, which is just a way of organizing multiple dimensions and measures. We'll discuss this a little bit more in our next nugget. We also have support for ranges. So let's say that you're looking at sales and you want to group different sales in ranges. For example, sales between 0 and 500,000 would be low, and sales between 500,000 and 1 million would be medium, and then sales over 1 million would be high. The UDM supports KPI, or Key Performance Indicators. These are just little graphical icons. So once again, let's say you have ranges, low, medium, and high. You can have graphical indicators supporting that. It also supports aggregations such as summing, average, min, max, count, and so on. And we also have sliding windows. So if you want to see, for example, the first 3 months of the year, the sales there, you can do that. You can also look at the sales for the second, third, and fourth month, and so on. I want to talk a little bit about the architecture of SSAS. Here we have the architecture of the analysis server. Keep in mind that you do have to have your analysis service up and running. So the way you do that is you simply go into your control panel, administrative tools, and then your services. Let me pull this up here for you so you can see it. Here are my different services, and I will scroll down to where I see my SQL Server. And you'll see here's my analysis servers. If yours is not already started, go ahead and double click on it and start it. The other service that you want to have up and running is your SQL Server browser. Okay, so let me minimize that. Your analysis server runs as a separate service, separate from the database itself. Your analysis server is going to communicate with the data source, and it can be multiple data sources. You might have some SQL Server databases, you might have some Oracle, DB2, and so on. As many data sources as you'd like. You can have multiple clients communicating with your analysis server. It uses what we call the XML native protocol, and there are several ways that the client can communicate with this analysis server. Generally speaking, it can communicate using SQL, MDX, DMX, or ASSL. We'll talk about these 4 different ways of communicating later in our next nugget. As far as what the analysis server does, well, it's going to parse the SQL statements that are issued. It also manages the metadata regarding your SSAS. It handles transactions. So remember, SSAS supports write back. So you can roll back changes that you've made. It also performs any calculations, any aggregations. It can also store and cache data locally. It can schedule queries to run on a regular basis, so if you need to run reports in the middle of the night, you can do that. And it manages its own resources. I want to talk about some of the very basic concepts of SSAS, and then we'll get into a simple example. You'll see here that we have some new terminology here. We have this thing called a dimension. Think of a dimension as a business entity that you want to measure things against. For example, here I might have some employees. That's my employee dimension. I also have quarters. That's my quarter dimension. And then we also have some numerical information, which is what we call our measure. You can group your measures into what we call measure groups. We'll cover an example of that in one of our later nuggets. So when we use the term cube, think of a cube as just being defined by the measures and dimensions. It's the combination of those two. Now this particular cube here is very simple because we only have 2 dimensions, but as I mentioned, we can have multiple dimensions. I might organize these employees into different departments. So maybe Bob and John belong to one department and Sue, Mary, and Joe belong to another department. I might decide to measure my sales by the departments as well as the employees. So the granularity just means how detailed do we want to get. Let's do a very simple example together. We're going to launch our SQL Server Business Intelligence Development Studio, and you should get this splash screen right here. We can just close that window real quick, and I'm just going to say New Project, and let's make sure this is an Analysis Services project. And let's call this Sales Analysis. If you have this blank screen here, you can go to your window and say Reset Window Layout, and just say, yes, I'm sure I want to do that. And you'll see here that we have data sources, data source views, cubes, dimensions, and those are the 4 things we're going to focus on in this nugget. So before we define any dimensions or measures or cubes, we need to define a data source. We can have multiple data sources, but for this example, let's just select one. Okay, so before we get into that, if you open up your SQL Server Management Studio, you can see that I have a database here called AdventureWorks DW. Under there, I have tables, and you'll see here that we have multiple tables. These tables that begin with dim are what we call dimension tables, and then we have some tables that begin with fact. Those are what we call the fact tables. They contain numeric data that are somehow related to these dimensions. So what I want to focus on is my fact reseller sales, and let's just look at the different columns here. You'll see here that we have some foreign keys defined, and these do point to some dimension tables. What I'm particularly interested in is the sales amount, and you'll see that one of the foreign keys here is the sales territory key, and another one is the order date key. Another table that I'm interested in is my dim sales territory. The columns here, we have the sales territory, region, country, and group. We're going to be particularly interested in the sales territory country and sales territory group. So now that we're familiar with the structure, let's look at SSAS environment. We need to have our data source. We'll say New Data Source, nice little splash page, and I don't have any data connections yet, so I'm going to create a new one. I'll say New, and the server name in my case is going to be Johnson. And I'll just use Windows Authentication. My database name here is AdventureWorks DW, and we can test our connection. Looks great. And then we'll hit OK. Now we can hit Next. As far as the credentials, I'm going to use the service account. If you choose to use a Windows username and password, that's fine. You can use the credentials of the current user or just inherit. Let's stick with the service account for right now. And this is the connection string that will be provided. Then we hit Finish. So we have our data source there, and it's quite a bit of information. Remember, we had all those different tables. We're not interested in all those tables. We want to filter out things until we just are looking at a real simplistic view. So I'm going to right-click on my data source view and create a new one. Here's our data source that we just created, and we'll hit Next. Here's all these tables. Well, the fact table, I usually start with that one. Here's my fact reseller sales, move that over there. And instead of browsing through here and finding the tables, the easiest way to do this is just to click on Add Related Tables, and it's going to find all the tables that have a foreign key relationship to this. So it splashed all those there. Now, I'm not particularly interested in all of these. I can get rid of, for example, the product, the promotion, the currency. We can get rid of the reseller, and employee. And so here we have just the time and the sales territory. Now we hit next. Here's a little preview of what we've got, and then we hit finish. What's nice about this, we can move this over here a little bit, is it gives us a graphical view of what our tables look like. It shows us the foreign key. Notice that we have an order date key, due date key, and a ship key that are all pointing to dim time. And we have our sales territory key pointing to our dim sales territory. Yes, well, that is our data source view. Now the next thing we can do, there's two ways we can do this. We can just delve right in and create a cube, and it will prompt us for what are the dimensions and so on, or we can go through this and create things manually. I'm going to show you the manual way first, just so you can understand how all the different pieces fit together. If you click on your dimensions, new dimension, remember we're only going to create 2 dimensions here. We have our nice little splash page. We're going to use an existing table that's in our data source view. Here's our data source view, and here are the 3 tables that we added to the view. So our dimension table will be dim sales territory. The key column is sales territory key, and the name column will also be sales territory key. We can hit next, and here are the different attributes that we can make available. Well, the sales territory key is kind of ugly because it's numeric and it doesn't really mean anything to a human. What we are interested in, though, is the sales territory country as well as the sales territory group. And then we'll hit next. We can just stick with the default name and then hit finish. Now the other dimension we want to add, right click on here, is going to be for the time. So we'll say use an existing table, and here's our dim time. Stick with the key column and name column. And what I'm only interested in here is the fiscal quarter as well as the fiscal year. Then we'll hit next and then finish. We have defined 2 dimensions, but we don't have a cube yet because we haven't defined any measures. Let's do this. I want you to create a new cube by right-clicking on cubes. Hit next. We're going to create an empty cube. Okay, now if we had said use existing tables, then it would go ahead and create the dimensions for us. But we're going to create an empty cube and then hit next. Here's our data source. Hit next. We'll call this Sales Cube, and then finish. Notice on the left-hand side that we have our measures and our dimensions, and it's empty right now. If we right-click on dimensions and say Add Cube Dimension, here are the dimensions that we just created. So let's go ahead and add these. Right-click on this again. Okay. We also want to add a measure. So we can right-click here on Measure and say New Measure. And as far as the usage here, we can go ahead and do the sum. So that's one of the aggregations it can do. The source table is going to be the fact reseller sales. And as I mentioned, what we're interested in is our sales amount. So notice that our fact table has a heading that's yellow, and our dimension tables have a heading that's blue. It's nice and color-coded. At this point, we can right-click on our cube, and it needs to be processed. So just click on the Process button, and it'll just say, hey, the server content appears to be out of date. Do we want to build and deploy the project first? Well, yes, we do. So you'll see a little progress bar right there, and then you can go ahead and click the Run button down here. And this usually just takes a few seconds, really depends on how many tables you're including. Now I'll go ahead and close this, Close that. And you'll see that if you click on this last tab, which is the Browser tab, you should get something that looks like this. Okay, so here we have our cube, we have our measures, and our different dimensions. I'm going to move this over here, and look at the nice little diagram we've got. We can drop row fields here, and we can drop filter fields here, and then drag our numeric data on here. One of the things we can do, let's go to our dim sales territory. Let's say we're just interested in the territory groups. Well, we can drag this onto there. You'll see that we've got Europe, North America, Pacific, and grand total. And now the numeric data under measures, we can grab the sales amount, drag it onto here. So here's the sales amount for these different territories. Now you can get a little more detailed if you want. Let's say you want to narrow it down to the countries. You can say sales territory country, drag that over here. Now notice that we have hierarchical information. So in Europe, we've got France, Germany, UK, and then the total. And we have totals for North America, Pacific, and grand total. All of that was done primarily through drag and drop. You can also format these numbers here pretty nicely. And the easiest way to do that is to go to your first tab again, which is just this diagram right here. And here's our sales amount. You can right-click on that, go to the properties. You'll see in the lower right-hand corner, that's usually where it shows up, we have a nice little format string. Well, we want our format string, maybe we want a $sign and commas and decimal places where they belong. You can do that. So whenever you make changes to your cube, you need to reprocess it. So I'm going to right-click, process it, say yes. By the way, you can also click the icon up here which does the processing. Make sure you say run, and then you can close your windows. So now when I go back to my browser, move that over there, all we need to do is refresh the page. So the way we refresh is by hitting this icon right up there, and you'll see that everything is nicely formatted. In this example, we simply used one dimension, which was our sales territory. You can do some more things with this. You can add information about the fiscal year simply by taking this and dragging it right there. And you'll see here that this can be categorized now. We have year 2003. If you expand that, we have sales in 2003 for Europe, North America, and Pacific, and it drills down to the countries. Another thing you can do, by the way, if you want to get rid of one of these categories, you can just take it and drag it back. You see how there's the little X? That removes it. So now we're back to the original. Okay, so another thing you can do is you can take this fiscal year, and instead of dragging it onto the rows, you can drag it onto the columns. So if you can either drag it or you can right click and say add to column area. And here we have the fiscal year. So if we move this over a little bit so you can see the whole thing, this can perform filtering. Okay, so here we have Europe, North America, Pacific, and these are the different years. We can click this drop down and say, you know what, I'm only interested in 2003. And once again, we have our grand totals. So just to review, there's two ways that you can move things over here. You can graphically drag and drop, or you can right click on things and add to column area or add to row area. Congratulations, you created your first cube. Let's talk about what we learned in this nugget. We first of all discussed the benefits of SSAS. Remember that you can issue any of your SQL statements directly to obtain this information. However, SSAS is graphical and it's a lot more intuitive. And you can quickly perform aggregations and change what kind of fields you want to view in your reporting. Make sure that you have your SQL Server Analytics services running by going to your control panel, and also make sure that you have your SQL Server browser running as well. We discussed the concepts such as dimensions, measures, and cubes. Remember that a cube is simply defined by the dimensions and measures, and the dimension usually represents some kind of entity such as a customer, or time, or product. The measure is the numerical value that we're measuring. With your cubes, you can define as many dimensions as you want to, and as many measures. Our simple example reported sales information on the region, as well as the fiscal year and quarter. In our next nugget, we'll look at some more advanced features. I'll show you how to implement your hierarchies. I'll show you how to rename your columns. We'll perform calculations and explore the other features of the cubes that we haven't discussed in this nugget. Well, I hope this has been informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.